Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And every year since I started making pixel art, I make a sprite of Luke Skywalker as sort of an ongoing exercise. Well, it started as sort of a skill growth check, but in recent years it's become more of just a tradition to keep going and have fun with, which was probably best characterized by last year's, which was just kind of a fun take on a Neo Geo Pocket style that I was really into at the time. Although this one also had the honor of being the first animated sprite in this collection. For this year's sprite, I'm going to go with something a little bit darker in tone, kind of both literally with the coloring, but also for the overall vibe or the mood of it. I think a really cool look is going to be a Jedi Luke sprite in the cloak with the hood up, kind of obscuring the face. And even though the cloak is going to be covering up a lot of the sprite, I'm still getting started here by creating a stick figure base just like I normally do. And that's just to make sure that the underlying structure of my sprite is still built upon some proper proportioning. As far as the styling goes, I'm aiming for something that sits somewhere between my 2019 Luke, which I always like the look of that one, and I actually always wanted to do more with that one, but just kind of never got around to it. But I've also got my Kusanagi sprite in there, which is from earlier this year, and that's just kind of there as a visual reference too. That one's a bit more representative of my stylistic choices at the moment, I suppose, and I kind of wanted to lean into that sort of color count and partial outlining style for this year's Jedi Luke. In building up the sprite silhouette, you can see I'm actually kind of leaving some negative space between some of the anatomy here, and that's just so I don't forget like how the pose is configured and everything. I realize that's actually maybe kind of an odd way to build things up, but it seems to work for me by the time that I get to adding the color here. So for the color selection, we've actually seen this type of outfit for Luke on a few different occasions. And my favorite presentation of it is where the cloak is in a dark brown rather than a black, like in the scene from Jabba's palace. I think that's just like an interesting color contrast with the black tunic underneath. And then the brown cloak is also like an earthy tone that complements his green lightsaber. So that's a color scheme that I'm developing for the sprite as well. To find an appropriate shade tone for the cloak, I've painted the black and the brown together with one of those at a 50% opacity. And that way the overlap kind of generates a color that's sitting exactly halfway between those. So with this darker tone, I'm doing a lap of rendering on the cloak to create some of the folds, but mostly I'm kind of also targeting areas that meet up with the line work and trying to give them kind of a softer blending at those edges. In the end, I'm really happy with how the styling came together on this one. He, looks appropriately mysterious just with the way that the face is obscured there. And I think the overall look here is just something that'll be quite unique among the other Luke sprites. Now, because last year's sprite was animated, I think that's probably got to just be a new part of the tradition going forward now. So I'm going to create an animation inspired by a little move from this familiar sequence here. The reason I selected this bit of choreography is just because of that great flow of the slash into the spin, and then coming out of that with the force push hand. So overall, that's just kind of the maneuver that I want to adapt. It can definitely be daunting to embark on a sprite animation like this, so to help me out, I've extracted a simplified version of the sprite to work with. One where the arms and legs are color-coded so I can keep track of their position while animating, rather than having them just get lost in a sea of brown cloak if I try to do it from the fully rendered sprite. My plan is just to focus on these main body parts and overall silhouette to kind of rough out the animation. And then once it's in a good spot, I can go through and render it to the full level of detail as a final step. For now, I had broken up that reference sequence into a series of images to use as a reference. These are going to represent the key poses of the animation. They'll be kind of the major beats that define the overall movement. One at a time, I'm going through each of these positions and interpreting the pose into my sprite structure and my own perspective on the character. For the most part, I found the easiest thing to do was to place the hands and the lightsaber first, since that's going to be one of the more important trackable details across the frames. And then I'd find a suitable position for the feet, just kind of based on where it was within the sequence. Another thing that really helped, and I highly recommend this, is that I actually kind of like acted this out several times for myself. Like I literally got up and tried out this choreography. You should have seen the way that they were looking at me in the coffee shop. No, I'm just kidding. I was definitely at home by myself. But the important thing is that you kind of gain a better understanding when you're doing these poses for yourself. In this case, it helped me to understand the way that the footing works and how there's kind of two rotating steps that are required to pull this off. So we can see with just these keyframes that even though it's choppy, we're just getting kind of a broad sense of the entire animation. And this actually wasn't a bad first approximation, but after seeing how things lined up here, I went back through and made some minor tweaks to the individual components. Just like the way that the lightsaber or the arms of adjacent frames flow into one another. And ended up at this rough sequence, which also includes the starting pose as well. The reason it's lacking in a bit of grace for now is just because it's missing the in-between frames that are going to provide that additional flow to glue all these poses together, as well as affording the control of the animation rhythm itself. To generate the in-between poses, I would just look at the current and the next frame, and then kind of decide if it needed something to glue those together. And it's not always about selecting a pose or like generating one that's exactly halfway between the two that already exist. Like sometimes you want your new pose to kind of favor one side over the other. Like let's say if you wanted it to kind of snap into a particular pose or kind of snap out of it quickly. And that's kind of what's allowing you to control the rhythm as you make all these new poses in there. So in that first round, I had that original pose and 6 sort of keyframes. After assessing for all the in-between and additional frames, this sequence grew to a total of 14 frames. Although a lot of these are actually subtle variations of that same end pose, just to have the fabric of the cloak kind of whip over and then settle down. In fact, the main spin frames were actually quite okay as is, and I mostly just needed a frame to connect the neutral pose to this sequence, and then a couple others to come out of that spin into the force hand. When we play this version now, you can see how all those in-between frames dramatically improve the fluidity. And those frames at the end help punctuate the physics here rather than having the animation come to a dead stop. So the final step here is going to be to take all these template sprites and then render them up to the level of the initial one from earlier. Which is obviously much easier to say than do, but my plan of attack here on this round was to render them up kind of one piece at a time. Like basically I would select a singular item like the lightsaber or a hand, and kind of go frame by frame and follow the rendering of that singular piece across the entire sequence. Going about it in this way kind of allows me just to lock into the logic of that particular piece and then keep that consistent across the animation. And then, you know, sort of slowly after several rounds of this treatment, the overall character starts to emerge. While rendering the cloak, there was also an opportunity to add additional flourishes that weren't possible with just the silhouette of the template sprite. Like I was using the shade tone here to kind of block out sections and sort of exaggerate that swooping directionality of the fabric. Another final stylistic item along these lines was to add in some cool like swoosh lines to the lightsaber as it sort of whips around for the spin and also for the slash. You know, not only will this look extra stylish and directional, but it also helps convey the idea that this object is traveling fast from frame to frame. And that's really the last piece here, so let's go ahead and take a look at the Luke sprite for 2021. Here we go. Alright, and there we have it. One thing that I wanted to point out was that I spent a lot of time tracking the placement of the darker pixels of the cloak to sort of give this effect of the fabric settling into place. Even though much of the silhouette is the same, playing with the placement of shading like this can give these sort of additional physics that help something like the cloak feel less rigid. And of course, here's the new full lineup, which is getting harder and harder to fit on the screen every year, especially with these animations and everything. I love how this year's came together. I think my favorite thing about it is just how unique the tone is compared to the rest. It sort of got me wondering like what direction I'll go next time, but you know, I guess I've got a year to think that over at least. Alright, so let's go ahead and close out with some CRT time. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.